So fresh off from a sea story or two last week, we have two stories that almost, well, do in fact, fall right on top of each other. That of Jairus' daughter and the hemorrhaging woman. We, of course, skip right over Jesus' encounter with the Gerasene demoniac. I don't know why, but what is clear is that as soon as Jesus arrives at the other side of the lake, he is beset, or encounters rather, crisis after crisis after crisis. I am sure that each one of you sitting here has had those days where seemingly everything that you don't want to have happen, happens. And it happens one right after another. The saying, when it rains, it pours, is an apt expression. I was going to say, unless you live in Oklahoma, but last night we got a lot of rain, a lot. And what is more, I think in moments like that, in Jesus' case and perhaps in yours, it seems like everyone wants or needs a piece of you. An experience that I gather is somewhat akin to what motherhood must feel like. People have looked to you, I'm guessing, in those moments to have the right answers or the best suggestions, because you are you, right? You are you. They look to you for many reasons. But one of them is surely that you can hold this thing down or lift it up, whatever it is. But what is for certain is that in those encounters, there is some intense emotional energy. A day in the life in the church is no different, often oscillating between moments of crisis and moments of celebration. Ministry tends to deal with both of these events regularly. Uh-oh's right. It never fails to catch you up or stop you short, however, when such things happen in the same day or happen right after one another. In some moments like that, you may ask yourself the question, well, what's next? That might be the question, that might be the refrain. Other times it might be like, well, I've seen it all now. Didn't know that it could totally rain inside of a building, but there you have it. It did. And if you're stretched thin enough, I imagine you've had this feeling too, if you're stretched thin enough in your life, you have in that moment perhaps the ever so slight tinge of like, what now? What can happen now? And in response to that, your friends, or perhaps some well-intentioned ministers like myself, would say, deep breaths, deep breaths. Weather the storm, they say. Or if you're more melodramatic, it will all be over soon. Perhaps like all of us felt after having watched the presidential debate. I mean, sheesh, right? How about this? And I'm going to switch it here. Here's the truth, the capital T truth. Ministry happens in the interruptions. You ever try to plan ministry? How's that go for you? I find it funny sometimes that people seem to start off conversations in ministry with, hey, sorry to bother you, but, and when pressed to not do that, right, they confess to not wanting to be a burden. That happens a lot. It's almost like they're saying, I'm private, I brood. Or perhaps, if it's a little bit darker situation, I'd rather suffer in silence because that's better than encountering unspoken and unmet expectations, Nick. No one has reached out to me. I guess I don't matter. Well, you do matter. Nothing could be further from the truth, right? I messed up there. You do matter. Strike that. But here's the thing. Even Jesus needed a little help in knowing what was going on. I mean, he had a clue in chapter 5, right? You wouldn't necessarily forget a large man with chains hanging off of him, screaming at himself, walking around in a graveyard. Something would clue you into that situation that something was going on, right? You wouldn't forget that. Even Jesus didn't know about Jairus' daughter until they told him about her. And even Jesus himself had to ask the question, who touched me, after having felt power going off from him. None of these events, in other words, were planned. They happened. And we, as interpreters of the word, classify these moments of encounter as miracles, perhaps largely due to their outcome. And maybe because things don't often always go to plan, that means we fail to see more miracles than there actually are. What's the saying about miracles? Miracles are a retelling in small letters, the very same story which is written across the world in letters too large for some of us to see. But if it is the outcome, if that's all that matters, then I think we miss the point. That the incarnation, Jesus, or if you're slightly more daring, the Christ in you or the Christ around you, is not so much a miracle that we ultimately believe for belief's sake, right? Like, I think, therefore it is. But rather is a presence we experience. A presence that we grow to trust, or as Dolores likes to put it, is the wondrous presence that loved us first. Those kind of experiences reveal something about God, I think. That God is committed to be present with us in this world. But there is something else too. One of my favorite prayers in Compline goes like this. O God, your unfailing providence sustains the world we live in and the life we live. Watch over those both night and day who work while others sleep, and grant that we may never forget that our common life depends upon each other's toil. In other words, we need each other. Even as we acknowledge this experience, this sustaining providence of God in our lives, we need each other. We need for him to answer prayer in us and for us to answer prayer in him. In the midst of storms, I trust that Jesus will show up, as I believe that you do too. Though not every person is healed, or every need met, or every estranged relationship reconciled, when 2 or 3 are gathered together, he will be in the midst of them. And that's not my promise. That's his. So much so that the experience of presence, his presence, our prayer, become a pattern that is reciprocal, flowing in and out of each other, much like the experiences of crisis and celebration do on any given day. Perhaps you might even look at it as birth and death. These things are always constantly happening in and through us and around us. And we know that prayer always isn't easy, right? Expanding our awareness of that, I think, begins over time to change our perspective about things like prayer and perhaps even miracles. so that at some point we can perhaps take a quote from Harold Kushner in stride, one who, unlike Jairus, once had to bury his son. He writes, "People who often pray for miracles usually don't get miracles any more than children who pray for bicycles, good grades, or good boyfriends get them as a result of praying. But people who pray for courage, for strength to bear the unbearable, for the grace to remember what they have left instead of what they've lost, very often find their prayers answered." In other words, and this is tough, in other words, miracles aren't the result of some transaction, but nevertheless become tangible through the mediums of answered prayers. And the funny thing is that the prayers that are answered may not be the ones that we first start out praying. And maybe they start out kind of like this. "Hey, do you have a minute? I don't mean to bother you, but my friend, I need some help.